In this component 2 exam technique screencast, I'm going to talk you through the component 2 examination paper, and what I'm going to do in this particular exercise is explain what I would be thinking if I was tackling this exam paper. And the purpose of this screencast is to mentally rehearse the types of things that you should be thinking in relation to time management and exam technique when you're actually in the exam. So let's start by looking at the front cover of the specimen component 2 exam paper. So here we can see the title of the exam, Methods of Sociological Inquiry, and remember that this component focuses on just one topic. It's the work that we've done on sociological research methods, and because it focuses on one topic, this is worth 20% of your final A-level grade. The other two components are each worth 40%. The timing for this paper is that you've got 1 hour and 45 minutes, and obviously what I would be thinking before I started the exam is that time management is absolutely crucial. And this is what the rest of the front cover of the examination paper will look like. And in addition to the examination paper, you can see that you'll also be given a 12-page answer booklet. And my advice with the answer booklet is to make sure that you don't cross anything out. So when you are answering your questions and when you're doing plans before your longer answers, don't put a line through any of your work, because if you do that, then the examiner cannot give you credit for anything that you've crossed out. So for example, if you do a plan for a longer answer and you run out of time, if you put a line through your plan, then the examiner cannot credit you for any of the knowledge that's contained within your plan that you didn't get the time to include in your actual answer. The other thing that I would recommend with your answer booklet is each time that you start a new question, you start a new page. The reason for that is that will leave you with a bit of space at the end of each answer, and if at the end of the exam you've got any time left over, you can come back to your questions and add some information at the end of each answer. You can see in the instructions that you've got to answer all of the questions on this particular exam paper. So because there are no options, every single question on the exam paper is compulsory, and you should make sure that you attempt every single question. You've got to use black ink or a black ballpoint pen, so make sure that you bring plenty of spares along to the exam. The total raw marks available on this particular paper are 60 marks, and the number of marks is given in brackets at the end of each question. And what I would be thinking when I do the exam is the amount of time that I spend on each section of the exam should reflect the number of marks available. So when you turn over your exam paper, this is what the rest of the paper will look like. These are the actual questions, and you can see that you will also be given a short bit of text that you need to read. This is what they call the item, and question 1 has 3 parts to it. In reality, it's really 3 questions: 1A, 1B and 1C, and all of these questions are closely related to the item. Question 2, which is where you've got to come up with a hypothetical research design, is not related to the item in any way. So let's start by looking at question 1, and you can see that above the item there's this instruction to read the following item and to answer all of the questions. I would actually read the questions first of all, and then I would read the item. And the reason for that is once you've read through the questions, then you've got a better idea of the type of information that you want to scan the item for. and the item needs to be read very, very carefully. The item will be a summary of a piece of sociological research, and you need to use the item to help you answer all of the different questions on this section of the exam paper. And you need to make sure that you don't just copy chunks from the item, but that you develop the material from the item, linking it to your own knowledge. So let's look at 1A, the first question. This is marked out of 5, and I recommend that you spend about 7 to 8 minutes on this particular question. So the question says, using material from the item and your own sociological knowledge, you've got to explain what is meant by a key sociological term that relates to research methods. And in the sample paper, you can see that you've got to explain what is meant by the positivist approach to research. And what I would be thinking in the exam is that I need to write a full paragraph to this particular question. So maybe about 3 to 4 sentences. And my first sentence, I need to clearly define the term. So I need to explain clearly and precisely what is meant by a positivist approach to research. And if my mind went blank in the exam, I would look very carefully at the item, because the term positivism is used in the item, and there will be some clues to help jog your memory. So we can see here that there's reference to positivism and a scientific approach, so that should help to jog your memory. Now, in addition to defining what is meant by a positivist approach, I need to refer to the item, and it's really the end of the item that is explicitly relevant to this particular question, where we've got discussion of positivism. And also I need to try to use an example of my own to illustrate the positivist approach. And what you can see on this particular slide is a model answer to this particular question. So we can see that the first sentence contains a very clear definition and explanation of positivism. Then we've got reference to the item, and always remember to explicitly signpost your use of the item so that the examiner is in no doubt whatsoever that you've used the item. And then at the end of this particular answer, we've got reference to an example taken from the candidate's own knowledge, this reference to Durkheim's study of suicide. And this is just right in terms of the amount that the candidate has written. Anything less than this would not be enough detail, but if the candidate was to write much more than this, then they would be overdoing it and taking time away from other sections of the exam where there's a higher mark allocation. Now 1B we can see is asking us to explain one reason why the researcher. Now the researcher is the person that is being described in the item. So in this case we can see it's Penelope Scott. So one reason why the researcher may have wanted to use in-depth interviews in her research. So in this particular question, we've got to explain not just a generic advantage of using in-depth interviews, we've got to make sure that the reason that we give and explain is specifically linked to the item, to this specific piece of research. And if we read the item, it should be clear that what is meant by in-depth interviews are interviews that produce rich, qualitative data, which we should know from our own knowledge would probably mean either semi or unstructured interviews. So with this question, what I would be thinking in the exam is that I really need to read and think about the item carefully and come up with a reason for the use of semi-structured or unstructured interviews that really links very clearly to this particular piece of research and the information that we've got here in the item. If I was to just give a generic advantage of unstructured interviews without relating it to the item, then the maximum mark that I would get out of 5 would only be 2. So what I would be thinking in the exam is that I really need to carefully scan the item. So if we look at the first sentence, we've got an explanation of the research aim, so investigating diabetes and the effects of this illness on British people of Caribbean descent. We've got here a possible reason that we could develop for why she used in-depth interviews. So she wanted to discover more about the everyday experiences of individuals living with the illness. So what I would be thinking in the exam is I would be thinking about why in-depth interviews are particularly helpful if you want to look at everyday experiences. So for example, I would be thinking that getting people to talk about their experiences of living with an illness could be potentially quite sensitive, and that one of the advantages of an in-depth interview is that would give me the time to develop trust and rapport with that particular individual, as well as giving me the time and space to try to achieve Verstehen by looking at how they interpret and make sense of their particular illness. In the next sentence, we've got another possible reason that we could develop in our answer. We've got this statement about the fact that she was aware that there was already statistical data about the illness, but that there wasn't very much in the way of qualitative research data. And we know that in-depth interviews are associated with qualitative research data. So one of the reasons that she went for this particular approach was to help her gather data that was not previously available on this particular topic. Now, in terms of time management, once again, we're looking at about 7 to 8 minutes on this particular section of the exam. Now, you should practice this type of 5-mark question by looking at the practice examination questions that I've given you. And one of the advantages of doing this is not just to build your confidence with 1B questions. Also, every time that you make use of the item, you are building up knowledge of key pieces of research that you can use as concrete examples in the 20-mark question. Because we'll see in a moment, for the 20-mark question, you have to refer to real pieces of research. And one of the ways in which you can build up those examples of real research is to look at items from previous past exam questions. And if you've lost your hard copy of the practice exam questions for this component, then you can find an electronic copy that you can print off yourself on iLearn. And you can also find sample answers to many of these practice questions if you look at your Brainscape set. 1C carries a lot more marks. We can see here that it's marked out of 20, and therefore you need to spend longer on this section of component 1. And I would recommend between about 30 to 35 minutes on this section of the paper, including the time to do a brief plan. This is essentially a mini essay answer. It's going to ask you again to refer to the item, so you must make sure that you use material from the item in your answer and signpost that explicitly in your answer. You've got to refer to sociological studies, so you can't just use this as your only example. You need I would suggest at least a couple of other sociological studies. And in this particular question, you're being asked to explain the strengths and weaknesses of quantitative research methods in sociological research. So the way in which I would structure this particular mini essay question is I would start with a brief introduction where I define what is meant by quantitative research methods, and then in the main body of my answer I need to explain firstly 2 to 3 strengths of quantitative research methods, and I would use a separate paragraph for each particular strength that I identify, explain and link to an example. And then you also need to look at 2 to 3 weaknesses of quantitative research methods. So again, another 2 to 3 paragraphs. And the way in which I would structure my paragraphs in the main body of the answer is I would begin each paragraph identifying the strength or the weakness that's going to be the topic of that paragraph. I would then develop and explain that strength or weakness in more detail, and then I would also make sure that my paragraph used an example wherever possible, so either the item or a sociological study. And then finally, with this mini essay question, I would also try to include a brief conclusion. And in this conclusion, what I would be thinking is that I need to say something that goes beyond the obvious. So lots of students simply end their answer by saying quantitative research methods have both advantages and disadvantages. And that, of course, is a waste of time because that's bland and just a statement of the obvious. So instead of that, what I would be thinking is maybe in the conclusion, maybe thinking about the most important strength of quantitative research methods or the most serious drawback of quantitative research methods. And I might link that to the types of topics and pieces of research that are best suited or least suited to quantitative research methods. Now, I've just mentioned the importance of using sociological studies. That is a clear requirement of the question, and if you don't do that, then you are going to chuck away some easy marks. So make sure that you've watched both of these screencasts that give you a range of examples of key studies that you can use in these 20-mark questions, and as I mentioned previously, also use the items from past examination questions to help you as well. So let's end this screencast by looking at question 2. Now question 2 is a standalone question. It's not related to the other questions or the item, and this question is the one that's going to ask you to come up with a hypothetical research design. We can see that this carries the most marks. It's marked out of 30. This will need to be your longest answer, and I suggest around about 55 to 60 minutes of your exam time on this particular question, and that includes your thinking and your planning time. Now, much of this question is worded in a standardized way, so you're always going to be asked to describe each stage of your research design, justifying the reasons for your choices at each particular stage, and then you're always going to be asked to discuss problems that may occur and the impact of these problems on the quality of the data collected. What you won't know in advance of the exam is the actual focus of your research project. So you need to scan the question for the information about the particular focus of your research project. So you need to scan the question to find out whether or not they're asking you to collect quantitative or qualitative data, or whether or not they're leaving that open to you. So we can see in this question there's an instruction to collect data, and it's up to you to decide whether or not you want to focus on quantitative or qualitative data. Never do both, choose one or the other. Then you need to scan the question for the research topic, so we can see that in the sample question it's attitudes towards social networking. And then the final thing that you need to scan the question for is information about the target population and your sample. So we can see that the instruction here is to focus on a sample of young people in your local area. Now, when you're answering this particular question, remember to use the template that I've given you to help you plan your answer. So this template lists the different stages of your research project that you need to address in your answer. It reminds you that you've got to justify each of the research decisions that you make, and that wherever possible your justification needs to link to some aspect of Grover. Remember, Grover is an acronym that is helpful in getting you to remember some of the key methodological issues that you need to consider when you are putting together a research design. In terms of the second part of the question, where you're talking about the problems, do this as you go. So don't have a separate section at the end of your answer. Do this as you are describing and justifying the different sections. You don't have to do this though for every single section. So though you need to describe and justify each section, when it comes to looking at the problems, what I suggest that you do is that you focus on the problems that are involved with your choice of method, with your choice of sampling technique, and then also any problems that would be involved in the actual gathering of your data. And again, when you're looking at the problems with your research design, try to link those problems wherever possible to some aspect of Grover. Now obviously prior to the exam, it would be a really good idea to come up with a pre-prepared research design for both quantitative data and qualitative data, so one of each. However, what I would be thinking in the exam, and this is really important, is that though it's a good idea to pre-plan research designs as part of my revision, my answer mustn't be so rehearsed that I don't take into account the very specific details of the design brief. So what you've got to do is adapt your pre-planned answer so that it really fits and links to the actual topic and the research population that you are given in the question. It can't just be a rehearsed answer that doesn't take into account the specifics of the question. Now, if you've not done so already, make sure that you watch or remind yourself at this particular screencast that goes through the 30-mark question in much more detail, goes through all of the different stages of the research design that you need to address in your answer. And also remember to use the 30-mark question exam preparation pack that I've given you to help you revise and prepare for this important question. And if you've lost the hard copy of that particular handout, if you go on to this particular section of iLearn, you can find an electronic copy of this essential exam preparation pack.